The surveillance alert came at 2:47 p.m. Arthur Sterling expected to catch his 40th caregiver stealing, slacking off, or quitting like the 39 before her. Instead, his screen showed 3 empty medical beds, unplugged equipment, and Elena, standing in darkness with a single candle, doing something to his nonverbal triplets that made his stomach drop. The room was silent. Too silent. And whatever she was doing to Grace, Hope, and Faith looked nothing like the medical protocol he'd paid millions to perfect. Arthur's finger hovered over the emergency call button. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. 3 years ago, Arthur Sterling lost the only person who could make him believe in things he couldn't control. Rebecca Sterling died on a Tuesday morning in April. No warning. No dramatic goodbye. Just a sudden aneurysm that took her between breakfast and the conference call she never made. One moment she was laughing at something their 3-month-old daughters had done. The next, she was gone. Arthur held her in their bedroom until the paramedics gently pulled him away. Then he walked down the hallway to the nursery where Grace, Hope, and Faith, tiny, fragile, perfect, slept in their matching cribs, unaware they would never hear their mother's voice again. The doctors didn't wait long to deliver the second blow. "Mr. Sterling, we need to discuss the girls' neurological assessments." Grace, Hope, and Faith had been born prematurely. What seemed like a blessing, 3 healthy daughters, revealed itself as something far more complicated. A rare genetic condition. Severe neurological impairment. The kind that settles into the nervous system and doesn't let go. Based on current imaging and developmental markers, verbal communication is highly unlikely. Fine motor control may never develop. We recommend preparing for long-term intensive care. Arthur heard the words, but they didn't land. Not then. He was still burying Rebecca in his mind, still trying to understand how the woman who'd made him believe anything was possible had simply stopped existing. Months passed. The girls didn't improve. They didn't babble like other infants. They didn't reach for toys. They sat in custom-designed chairs, their small bodies still, their eyes distant, tracking nothing. Arthur flew in specialists from Switzerland, purchased sensory equipment that cost more than most people's annual salaries, hired the best pediatric neurologists money could buy. Nothing changed. The girls didn't speak. They barely moved. And Arthur, alone in his Connecticut estate that suddenly felt too large and too quiet, started to accept what the doctors said. His daughters would never call him daddy. They would never run through these hallways. They would never become the vibrant, chaotic force Rebecca had imagined them to be. He buried that hope right next to his wife. Then came the caregivers. 39 caregivers in 18 months. The first lasted 2 weeks before she quit, saying the silence in the house made her uncomfortable. The second spent more time documenting the mansion for her social media than caring for the girls. Arthur fired her on the spot. The third seemed perfect. Ivy League education, pediatric nursing certification, glowing references. Then he discovered she'd been sedating the girls beyond their prescribed dosages to make her shifts easier. She left in handcuffs. After that, something inside Arthur calcified. One caregiver sold photos of the girls' medical equipment to a gossip blog for $800. Another tried to access his offshore accounts. A highly recommended specialist from Boston lasted 3 days before admitting she couldn't handle working with children who couldn't respond. Each betrayal added another layer to the fortress Arthur was building. More cameras. More protocols. More control. He stopped seeing people as people. He saw liabilities, risks, inevitable disappointments wrapped in smiles and references he could never fully verify. By the time Elena Bailey walked through his door, Arthur had perfected his emotional detachment. She arrived on a gray October morning carrying a single wooden crate. No designer luggage. No portfolio of credentials. Just that box, worn at the edges, and a calmness that felt almost unnatural. Arthur didn't stand when she entered his office. He slid a 50-page medical manual across his desk, laminated, color-coded, indexed. "This is the protocol," he said, his voice flat. "Every medication is timed to the minute. Every sensory exercise is documented. The girls are on a strict schedule that cannot be deviated from under any circumstances." Elena's eyes moved to the manual, then back to him. She didn't reach for it. "The equipment is state-of-the-art," Arthur continued. "The monitoring system tracks their vitals in real time. You'll receive alerts if anything falls outside normal parameters. Your job is to follow the protocol exactly as written. No improvising. No bonding. No hope speeches." That last word came out harder than he intended. Elena stood quietly, her hands folded in front of her. She was a black woman in her mid-30s, with natural hair pulled back and an expression that gave away nothing. There was a dignity in the way she held herself, something unshakable that Arthur found both impressive and irritating. "The doctors have made their prognosis clear," he added, softer now but no less firm. "Grace, hope, and faith will never communicate verbally. They will never develop fine motor skills. Your role is maintenance, not miracles. Do you understand?" "I understand what you're saying," Elena replied. Her voice was measured, calm. Arthur's jaw tightened. That wasn't the answer he wanted. "The previous 39 caregivers all understood too," he said, leaning back in his chair. "They understood right up until they didn't. Until they stole from me, exploited my daughters, or walked out because the work was too depressing. So let me be clear, I have cameras in every room. I review the footage. If you deviate from the protocol, if you give me any reason to question your judgment, you're gone. No warnings. No second chances." Elena nodded slowly. "May I meet them?" Arthur blinked. Most applicants asked about salary, time off, living arrangements. She wanted to meet the girls. He stood, leading her down the hallway toward what he privately called the Glass Museum. The room where his daughters existed in their high-tech isolation. Where hope went to die under fluorescent lights and medical monitors. He opened the door. Elena stepped inside, and for the first time since she'd arrived, her expression changed. Not pity. Not a shock. Something else Arthur couldn't name. She set her wooden crate down gently and walked toward Grace, hope, and faith. And Arthur, watching from the doorway, felt the familiar tightness in his chest. The same tightness that came every time someone new saw his daughters for the first time. He was already preparing for her to fail. It happened on Elena's 5th night. Arthur was in his office reviewing quarterly reports when the alert chimed on his phone. Motion detected in the girls' room. He pulled up the live feed, expecting to see Elena performing the standard evening routine. Instead, he saw her walking toward the white noise machines. His hand tightened around the phone. Those machines had been prescribed by Dr. Weinstein, the top pediatric neurologist in the country. They created a controlled auditory environment, preventing sensory overload that could trigger seizures or distress. Arthur had spent $4,000 on each unit. Elena reached for the power button. Arthur's finger moved to the intercom. One word and she'd be gone. But he hesitated. She turned off all 3 machines. The room fell into a silence that felt almost violent. Then she moved to the windows, floor-to-ceiling glass that overlooked the Connecticut estate, and pulled back the heavy blackout curtains Arthur had installed. Outside, a thunderstorm was building. Dark clouds rolled across the sky, lightning flickering in the distance. Elena opened the windows. Wind rushed into the room, cool and wild. Rain began to spatter against the glass. And then she did something that made Arthur's breath catch. She removed the girls' noise-canceling headphones. "What are you doing?" Arthur whispered to the screen, even though she couldn't hear him. Grace, Hope, and Faith sat in their adaptive chairs, suddenly exposed to chaos. The storm. The wind. The unpredictable fury of nature that the medical protocol explicitly warned against. Arthur's thumb hovered over Elena's contact. One call. One termination. This was exactly the kind of reckless behavior that. Lightning cracked across the sky. and Grace's eyes moved. Arthur froze. Grace's gaze, usually distant and unfocused, tracked the lightning from left to right. Her head turned slightly, following the flash across the window. It was the first intentional movement he'd seen from her in over a year. Thunder rolled through the room, deep and resonant. Hope's fingers twitched. Faith's breathing changed, becoming faster, more engaged. Elena knelt in front of them, not speaking, just watching. Studying their reactions like she was reading a language only she understood. Another lightning strike. Grace's eyes followed it again. Arthur set his phone down on the desk. His hands were shaking. The medical protocol said sensory overload was dangerous. That unpredictable stimuli could cause regression, anxiety, neurological distress. But as he watched his daughters, really watched them, he saw something the doctors had never mentioned. He saw them experiencing the world. Grace's pupils dilated with each flash of lightning. Hope's chest rose and fell with the rhythm of the thunder. Faith's head tilted toward the sound of rain hitting glass. They weren't distressed. They were awake. Elena remained perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, letting the storm do the work she couldn't. And Arthur, alone in his office with the blue glow of monitors lighting his face, realized he was witnessing something that wasn't in any medical manual. He was watching his daughters feel something. The intercom button remained untouched. The termination call is unmade. Outside, the storm raged. Inside, 3 little girls discovered that the world was loud, chaotic, and alive. And their father, 3,000 miles away in a glass tower, felt the first crack form in the fortress he'd built around his heart. Arthur almost fired her again on Tuesday. He was watching the live feed during a conference call, half listening to investors discuss third-quarter projections, when he saw Elena wheeling the girls into the home theater. That room was off-limits. The medical team had been explicit: no unnecessary stimulation, no loud noises, no deviations from the controlled environment. Elena positioned Grace, Hope, and Faith in a semicircle facing the massive subwoofer Arthur had installed back when he still hosted charity galas. Back when the house had been filled with people and laughter and Rebecca. He muted his microphone. "What is she doing?" Elena opened her wooden crate, the same one she'd arrived with, and pulled out what looked like handheld drums. Small, simple instruments that seemed almost primitive compared to the $100,000 medical equipment surrounding them. She placed one drum on the subwoofer and struck it. The sound was low, guttural, more vibration than music. Arthur watched the speaker's pulse with the frequency. Then Elena did something that made his stomach tighten. She took Grace's hand, her small, limp hand that hadn't grasped anything in 6 years, and placed it directly on the subwoofer's surface. "Stop," Arthur said to the screen. "You're going to hurt her." But Elena wasn't watching him. She was watching Grace. She struck the drum again. The vibration traveled through the subwoofer, into Grace's palm, up her arm. Arthur could see the ripple of it moving through his daughter's body. Grace's fingers twitched. Arthur leaned closer to the monitor. Elena placed Hope's hand on the subwoofer next, then Faith's. 3 small hands pressed against the black surface. She struck the drum again, this time holding the beat longer, letting the frequency sustain. All 3 girls' fingers began to move. Not randomly. Not in spasm. In rhythm. Arthur's conference call continued in the background, investors droning on about profit margins and market share, but he couldn't hear them anymore. He was fixated on the screen, watching Elena strike the drum in patterns, slow, then fast, then slow again. And his daughter's fingers followed. Grace's index finger tapped against the subwoofer. Once. Twice. 3 times in sequence. Hope's hand opened and closed with the beat. Faith's pinky finger curled and uncurled, matching the frequency. Elena wasn't just playing music. She was studying them. Watching how the vibration traveled through their skin, their muscles, their nervous systems. She was mapping their responses like a scientist, but with the patience of someone who actually cared about the data. Arthur pulled up the medical file on his computer. Scrolled to Dr. Weinstein's notes. Fine motor control, unlikely to develop. Nerve pathways show significant degradation. Recommend focus on comfort rather than rehabilitation. But on his screen, Faith's entire hand was moving now, fingers spreading wide, then closing into a fist, then opening again. Elena struck a different drum. Lower frequency. Deeper resonance. The girl's responses changed. Grace's hand moved in wider circles. Hope's fingers began to drum against the subwoofer independently. This wasn't therapy. This was a discovery. Arthur realized he'd been holding his breath. A voice crackled through his computer speaker. "Arthur? Are you still there?" The conference call. The investors. The world he'd built his life around. "I have to go," Arthur said, and disconnected. He sat in his office, watching a woman with no formal credentials do what a team of world-class neurologists had said was impossible. She was teaching his daughters to remember their own bodies. And for the first time in 3 years, Arthur Sterling felt something he'd buried alongside his wife. Curiosity. The alert came at 2:14 p.m. on a Saturday. Arthur was reviewing acquisition documents when his phone buzzed. External motion detected. Back garden. He opened the app expecting to see the landscaping crew. Instead, he saw Elena pushing all 3 wheelchairs across the wet grass toward the far corner of the property. It was raining. Not a thunderstorm like before, but a steady, cold October rain that had been falling since morning. Arthur zoomed in. Elena stopped the wheelchairs near the old garden, the section Rebecca had planned to convert into a meditation space before she died. It was overgrown now, wild, nothing but mud and weeds and forgotten dreams. Then Elena did something that made Arthur's blood run cold. She lifted Grace out of her wheelchair and set her on the ground. "No," Arthur said aloud, standing up from his desk. "No, no, no." Grace's legs couldn't support her weight. Her muscles had atrophied from years of immobility. The medical protocol was explicit. The girls were never to be removed from their supportive seating without proper equipment and supervision. But Elena wasn't putting her back. She placed Grace on the wet earth and stepped back. Arthur's finger hovered over the emergency call button. This was negligence. This was exactly the kind of dangerous, misguided. Grace's hands sank into the mud. She didn't recoil. Didn't cry. Her fingers spread wide, pressing into the cold, wet soil like she was reading it. Elena lifted Hope out next, then Faith. All 3 girls on the ground, rain falling on their faces, their prescribed medical gowns soaking through. It looked like abandonment. Like cruelty. Arthur grabbed his car keys. The estate was 40 minutes away, but he could call the local police, have them therein. Hope moved her leg. Not a spasm. Not involuntary. She bent her knee and dragged her foot through the mud, creating a line. Arthur's hand froze on his phone. Faith rolled onto her side, her face pressing against the grass. She was breathing differently, deeper, like she was inhaling the earth itself. Grace's fingers dug into the soil, gripping, releasing, gripping again. Her face tilted upward, rain falling directly into her eyes, and she didn't blink away. She let it hit her, let it run down her cheeks like tears she'd never learned to cry. Elena sat in the mud with them. Not directing, not instructing. Just a present. Her white uniform was ruined, covered in dirt and grass stains, but she didn't seem to notice or care. Arthur watched Hope drag herself forward using her arms. 6 inches. Then another 6. The movements were clumsy, uncoordinated, but they were movements. Real, intentional movements across ground that wasn't sterile or temperature-controlled or approved by a medical board. This was the earth. Raw. Unpredictable. Alive. Faith grabbed a fistful of wet leaves and brought them to her face. She inhaled. Her mouth opened slightly, and Arthur realized she was tasting the rain. For 6 years, his daughters had lived in a controlled environment. Perfect temperature. Filtered air. Smooth surfaces designed for safety and hygiene. They had never felt dirt under their fingernails. Never smelled wet grass. Never experienced the cold shock of rain on skin. They had been kept alive. But they had never been allowed to live. Elena remained motionless, letting the girls explore at their own pace. Hope crawled toward a small puddle, her reflection wavering in the water. She touched it, watched the ripples spread, and touched it again. Grace was making sounds. Not words, but sounds. Small, guttural noises of discovery. Arthur's phone slipped from his hand onto the desk. The medical protocol called this negligence. The experts would call this dangerous. His lawyers would call this liability. But as Arthur watched his daughters experience the world for the first time, truly experience it, without filters or barriers or fear, he saw what Elena had seen from the beginning. They weren't broken machines that needed maintenance. They were human beings who'd been locked in a prison built from love and terror. And Elena, the woman he'd hired expecting to fail, was setting them free one handful of mud at a time. Arthur's emergency call went unmade. His finger moved away from the button. Instead, he just watched. And for the first time in 3 years, he didn't try to control what happened next. Arthur hired the investigator on a Wednesday. Not because Elena had done anything wrong. That was the problem. She hadn't broken any rules he could articulate. Hadn't stolen. Hadn't quit. Hadn't harmed the girls. But she was changing everything, and Arthur needed to know why. Her background check was clean, he told Marcus Chen, a private investigator who'd helped him vet previous caregivers. But I need to know who she really is. Marcus called back 72 hours later. You're going to want to sit down for this, he said. Arthur was already sitting in his office, whiskey untouched on the desk. Tell me. Elena Bailey wasn't always Elena Bailey. 10 years ago, she was Dr. Elena Bailey Morrison. She had a practice in Boston. Specialized in music therapy for neurological conditions. She was considered one of the best in the country. Arthur's hand tightened around his glass. What happened? She had a daughter. Mara. Beautiful kid, by all accounts. Born with a degenerative neurological disorder. Similar to what your daughters have, but progressive. The doctors gave Mara 3 years. Arthur's throat went dry. Dr. Bailey Morrison spent those 3 years trying everything. Experimental treatments. Alternative therapies. She developed new techniques, published papers, became almost obsessive about finding a cure. But nothing worked. How long ago did the daughter die? 4 years. Mara made it to 7 years old. Outlived every prognosis. And when she finally passed, Dr. Bailey Morrison disappeared. Closed her practice. Dropped off the grid completely. Changed her name, moved across the country. Until she showed up at your door 3 months ago. Arthur set down his glass. His hand was shaking. There's more, Marcus continued. I found her old patient records, sealed, but I have sources. Every single case she took after her daughter's diagnosis was considered hopeless. Kids the medical community had written off. And she got results. Not cures, but improvements. Things the doctors said were impossible. Why did she stop? Guilt, maybe. Grief. The files suggest she blamed herself for not saving Mara. Some of her colleagues said she became convinced that the medical establishment's focus on managing expectations was actually preventing breakthroughs. That's why she disappeared. She couldn't watch another child die while doctors told parents to accept the impossible. Arthur stood, walked to the window. Below, he could see the garden where Elena had taken the girls yesterday. The mud was still disturbed from their movements. So she's using my daughters as some kind of redemption project. I don't think so, Marcus said carefully. I think she sees 3 children who've been told they'll never improve, and she can't stand it. The money you're paying her? It's a fraction of what she used to make. She's not there for your salary, Mr. Sterling. She's there because she believes something the rest of the world stopped believing. What's that? That impossible isn't final. Arthur ended the call. Sat in silence for 20 minutes. Elena had lost a daughter. Just like he'd lost a wife. She'd spent years fighting against a diagnosis. just like he'd spent years accepting one. But where Arthur had built cameras and protocols and walls, Elena had built belief. She was dangerous. Marcus was right about that. But not because she was incompetent or malicious or negligent. She was dangerous because she had nothing left to lose. No reputation to protect. No career to salvage. No hope to bury. She'd already lost everything. Which meant she was free to risk everything. And Arthur, watching the live feed of Elena singing softly to his daughters as they lay on the floor surrounded by instruments he didn't recognize, realized something that made his chest ache. She wasn't trying to fix Grace, Hope, and Faith. She was trying to free them. Just like she'd tried to free her own daughter. Just like she'd failed. And just like she'd never stopped trying anyway. Arthur pulled up the termination letter he'd drafted 3 times in the past month. Each time, he'd stopped himself from sending it. Now he knew why. Elena Bailey wasn't the 40th failure. She was the first person who'd entered his house and seen his daughters as something other than broken. And that terrified him more than any betrayal ever could. The alert came at 9:43 p.m. Arthur was on his private jet, returning from a meeting in Tokyo. He'd been gone for 4 days, the longest he'd left the girls since Rebecca died. His phone buzzed. Motion detected. Living room. He opened the app expecting to see Elena performing the evening routine. Instead, the screen showed something that made his pulse spike. The room was dark. All the lights were off. The medical monitors were unplugged, their screens black. The only illumination came from a single candle flickering on the floor. What the hell? Elena sat in the center of the room, the candle in front of her. Grace, Hope, and Faith were positioned around her in a circle, still in their adaptive chairs but leaning forward in a way Arthur had never seen before. Elena was singing. No instruments. No equipment. Just her voice, low and resonant, filling the darkness with a melody Arthur didn't recognize. He turned up the volume on his phone, pressed it to his ear. The song was wordless, just pure sound. A frequency that seemed to vibrate through the phone's tiny speaker and into his chest. Grace's mouth was open. Arthur's hand started shaking. She wasn't eating. Wasn't yawning. Her mouth was open, and her throat was moving, and she was. A sound came through the speaker. Faint. Fragile. But undeniably there. Grace was humming. Arthur stopped breathing. The sound was broken, inconsistent, like vocal cords that had forgotten their purpose suddenly remembering. But it was there. A vibration matching Elena's frequency. Then Hope joined. Her sound was different, higher-pitched, wavering. But it was intentional. Deliberate. She was trying to match the song. Elena didn't stop singing. Didn't react. She just continued, her voice steady and strong, creating a foundation for the girls to build on. Faith's mouth opened next. And then Arthur heard it. 3 voices. Damaged, imperfect, but harmonizing. His daughters, who hadn't made a sound in 6 years, who doctors said would never speak, never communicate, never find their voices, were singing. The phone slipped from Arthur's hand. He caught it before it hit the floor, hands trembling so badly he could barely hold it. He stood in the narrow aisle of the jet, 40,000 feet above the Pacific Ocean, listening to a miracle happen through a screen. The harmony held for 5 seconds. Then 10. Then 20. Grace's voice grew stronger. Hope found the rhythm. Faith added a depth that made the 3-part harmony complete. Elena's eyes were closed, tears streaming down her face, but she didn't stop singing. She gave them the melody and let them fill in the spaces around it. Arthur's vision blurred. For 6 years, he'd watched his daughters through cameras. Monitored their vitals. Tracked their movements. Documented their silence. He'd built an entire system designed to manage their condition, to accept their limitations, to keep them safe in their impossible prison. And in that moment, sitting on a jet thousands of miles away, listening to 3 voices that shouldn't exist, Arthur realized what Elena had understood from the beginning. The impossible didn't need permission. It just needed someone willing to believe. Grace hit a note that was almost clear. Hope followed. Faith sustained a low hum that vibrated through the phone's speaker like the earth itself was singing. And Arthur Sterling, venture capitalist, billionaire, man who'd built empires on data and control, collapsed into his leather seat and sobbed. The song continued. Elena's voice guiding them. Grace, Hope, and Faith finding their way through the darkness with nothing but sound. On the screen, the candle flickered. The shadows danced. And three little girls who'd been silent their entire lives filled their father's world with music. Arthur didn't wipe away his tears. He just listened. And for the first time since Rebecca died, he let himself hope. The flight attendant found him 20 minutes later, still holding his phone, tears drying on his face. "Mr. Sterling? Is everything all right?" Arthur couldn't speak. He just nodded, waving her away. On the screen, Elena had stopped singing. The girls were quiet now, exhausted. But Grace's hand was resting on Hope's arm. Faith's head was tilted toward her sisters. They were touching each other, comforting each other, being human with each other. Arthur opened his laptop with shaking hands. Pulled up the document he'd been drafting for 3 weeks. Due to repeated violations of medical protocol and unauthorized deviation from approved care standards. He'd written it after the thunderstorm. Revised it after the garden incident. Finalized it after the investigation revealed who she really was. His cursor hovered over the delete button. Every logical part of his brain screamed at him to send it. Elena was a liability. She was practicing medicine without a license. She was exposing his daughters to risks that could result in seizures, regression, injury, lawsuits. But his daughters were singing. The doctors said it was impossible. The neurologists said their vocal cords were too damaged. The specialists said their neural pathways couldn't support speech. They were all wrong. Arthur deleted the letter. Permanently. Then emptied the trash folder for good measure. He pulled up his messages to Elena. Typed, "I'm on my way home. Don't stop." Then he deleted it. Too vague. Too emotional. He tried again. "The work you're doing is remarkable. Continue." Deleted. Too clinical. Finally, "Thank you." He sent it before he could overthink it. 3 hours remained on the flight. Arthur spent them watching the recorded footage from the evening, rewinding the moment Grace first made sound, watching Hope's face as she discovered her own voice, seeing Faith's body relax into the music. He'd spent millions on medical equipment. Hired the best specialists money could buy. Built a fortress of technology designed to keep his daughters safe. And a woman with a wooden crate and a broken heart had done what all his money couldn't. She'd given them back their voices. Arthur opened his contact list. Found Dr. Weinstein's number. Stared at it for 5 minutes. He should call. Report the unauthorized treatment. Consult about the risks. Follow protocol. He closed the contact list. Protocol had kept his daughters alive. But Elena had made them living. There was a difference. He saw that now. The plane began its descent into New York. Arthur looked out the window at the city lights below, thinking about the mansion in Connecticut. About 3 little girls who'd spent 6 years in silence. About a woman who'd lost her own daughter and refused to let anyone else's remain lost. About the cameras he'd installed to catch people failing. About how they'd captured a miracle instead. He thought about Rebecca. What she would say if she could see their daughters now. If she could hear them singing. She would have fired him for waiting this long. The thought made him smile through fresh tears. When the plane landed, Arthur didn't go to his penthouse in Manhattan. He instructed his driver to take him straight to Connecticut. It was nearly midnight when the car pulled up to the estate. The house was dark except for a single light in the living room. Arthur sat in the back seat, watching that light. He'd spent 3 years believing his daughters were broken. That their condition was permanent. That acceptance was the same as love. He'd been wrong about everything. The deep flaw Elena had exposed wasn't in his daughters. It was in him. He'd been too afraid to hope because hoping meant risking another loss. Another funeral. Another grave next to Rebecca's. So he'd chosen data over faith, control over belief, surveillance over presence. He'd been watching his daughters die slowly while pretending he was keeping them alive. Arthur opened the car door. Time to stop watching. Time to start living. Arthur entered the house quietly, leaving his luggage in the car. The living room light was still on. He could hear soft music playing, not Elena's voice this time, but recorded instruments. Gentle, rhythmic. He stopped in the doorway. Elena sat on the floor, her back against the couch. Grace, Hope, and Faith were out of their chairs, lying on cushions arranged in a semicircle. The medical monitors were still unplugged. The white noise machines are still silent. The room looked nothing like the sterile environment he'd designed. It looked like a home. Elena saw him first. She started to stand, but Arthur raised his hand. "Don't," he said softly. "Please." He walked across the room, past the expensive equipment gathering dust, past the cameras that had recorded everything but understood nothing. He knelt on the floor beside his daughters. Grace's eyes found his face. Really looked at him. Not through him, not past him. At him. "Hi, sweetheart," Arthur whispered. His voice cracked on the second word. Hope turned her head toward him. Faith's hand moved, fingers stretching toward his knee. Arthur had touched his daughters 1,000 times. Medical checks. Transfers to wheelchairs. Adjustments to equipment. But he hadn't held them. Not really. Not since Rebecca died. He was afraid if he got too close, he'd break. Or worse, they would. But looking at them now, Grace with awareness in her eyes, Hope with movement in her limbs, Faith with intention in her reach, he realized the only thing breaking was the lie he'd been telling himself. That distance could protect him from loss. That control could replace love. That surveillance was the same as being present. "I'm sorry," he said, and he wasn't sure if he was talking to his daughters or to Elena or to Rebecca or to himself. "I'm so sorry." Elena remained silent, giving him space. Arthur looked up at her. This woman who'd lost her own daughter. Who'd disappeared from the world rather than watch another child be written off as impossible. Who'd shown up at his door with nothing but a wooden crate and belief he couldn't afford. "Stay," he said. "Please stay." Elena's eyes glistened. "I'm not going anywhere." Arthur turned back to his daughters. "Can you teach me?" "Teach you what?" "How to see them the way you do." Elena smiled. "You're already learning." She reached into her crate and pulled out a small drum. Handed it to Arthur. "Just follow the rhythm," she said. She began to hum. The same melody from earlier. The one that had shattered impossible into pieces. Arthur struck the drum. Clumsy. Uncertain. Grace's mouth opened. That fragile, beautiful sound emerged. Hope joined. Then Faith. And Arthur Sterling, who'd spent 3 years watching his daughters through screens, finally joined them in the only place that mattered. Not behind a camera. Not separated by distance and fear and grief. But here. On the floor. In the mess and chaos and imperfect beauty of trying. Elena's voice strengthened. The girls' harmony grew. Arthur's drum found the rhythm. Outside, the first snow of the season began to fall. Inside, a family that had been broken by loss and fear and impossible diagnoses began to heal. Not because a miracle happened, but because someone finally stopped asking permission for it. The song continued. Imperfect. Unrehearsed. Real. And in that living room in Connecticut, surrounded by unplugged monitors and abandoned protocols, Arthur Sterling learned what his daughters had known all along. Miracles don't need permission. They just need someone willing to believe. If this story touched your heart, please hit that like button and share it with someone who needs hope today. Don't forget to subscribe for more inspiring stories that remind us miracles don't need permission, they just need belief. Thank you for watching.